While there's been such a focus on domestic political issues here in America, there's been a whole lot going on overseas, and we're going to carve out a little time in tonight's program to focus on it. To help us is Jim J. Carafano, director of the Center for Foreign Policy Studies over there at Heritage Foundation, and a good friend of the program. Jim, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks. I was really lonely, so I appreciate the
I know. Well, listen, we got a lot going on here right now, but let's look at Europe first of all. Finland is now officially a member of NATO, and I'm told that's a pretty big deal. Why?
well, it's very interesting because, 6 months ago, Putin said, "Well, who cares if Finland and Sweden join NATO?" And now they've been screaming like it's the end of the world. And what's the
Yeah.
difference? Well, 6 months ago, Putin was planning this winter offensive, which he thought was just going to plow through the Ukrainians, and he's been humiliated. And so now all of a sudden he's worried that this is a big deal. So let's look at the numbers because again, kind of the conservative narrative is the Europeans aren't carrying their weight. We need to pivot from them, pivot to China. The reality is, of course, is when you look at what Russia is doing in Europe, the biggest cheerleader for that is China, that wants the United States, that wants the West, and particularly Europe, distracted, disorganized, see the U.S. pushed out. So the reality is a defeat for Russia in Europe is also a blow to Chinese policy, and that's good for the U.S. So what does Finland bring to the table? First of all, the Finns are already spending above 2% GDP. That's the benchmark for a contribution of a NATO country. So they already exceed that when they come in. What do they bring in? 800 miles, over 800 miles of border with Russia. That's a big problem for the Russians because now they cannot confidently, between having their military completely demolished by the Ukrainians, they can't really think about invading anybody and not have to worry about a NATO country and not worry about their northern flank, which is now completely vulnerable. The Finns bring the largest artillery force in all of Europe. So they bring a lot of combat power to the table. 280,000 folks under arms. It's a well-trained army. So the northern flank is very, very defensible. So, and then if you take now, Finland, Sweden, and Norway will all cooperate with their naval assets and their air assets. And if you think of the NATO alliance, right now, the Baltic Sea, which includes on the north Finland, Sweden, and NATO, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and on the southern part, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. That's now a NATO lake.
Yeah.
So the Russians just lost a whole operational theater where they could threaten NATO. So this is a strategic blunder. It's not a problem for Russia if you're worried about NATO invading Russia, because NATO has no interest and actually doesn't really have the capability to do that. It's a huge strategic blow to Russia if you want to use your military to threaten NATO.
Yeah. And that kind of pressure, obviously, not only does it drain Putin's focus and potentially resources, but it also sort of like shifts. I'm thinking of the old board game Risk now, right? Where you
Right.
move you try to conquer, but that's really what we're looking at here. This does sort of shift a little bit of a balance where he's focusing on the southern part of Eastern Europe, and now, as you said, that the Baltics and the whole northern area of Scandinavia is now all aligned together. If they weren't in spirit, they are now on paper. That could very well be. Is he going to feel the pressure in Moscow now? It seems like everybody in the West,
Yeah.
Mr. Carafano, is waiting for someone in Moscow to step up and say, "This guy is ruining us."
No, I don't think so. I mean, he has such firm control. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, the czar thought he was going to be there forever, but Putin has such firm control over everything and all the people that have power and influence. He has, overwatch over all of them. So actually, we just met with the Finns and their assessment, and they have the best read on the Russians. There's no real threat to Putin's power. Nobody in Europe really thinks that, but it's not just now the northern flank becomes a big obstacle to Putin. Don't forget, Ukraine now has probably the most well combat experienced military in Europe and one of the largest military in Europe. So that's a problem. And then when you look at southern Europe, what's going on? Romanians, other countries lining up really to shore up the southern flank. So Putin has really, it's like when you inject a vaccine and it promotes an immune response, Putin has really done that, and it's not just, again, it's not just a defeat for Putin. And Finland's a good example. It's a defeat for China. The
Yeah.
Finns have got very risk averse about doing business with the Chinese. Now, it's not over. They aren't saying like, "Oh, you're banned in Finland." But if you look, for example, like at their big telecom company, which is it Ericsson or Nokia? I can't remember. Doesn't matter. They do a lot of business in China. They're divesting out of China because
Hmm.
it's not a good market and going elsewhere. The Finns don't allow Huawei in there, and they didn't do it by saying we ban Huawei. They just said, well, if you're a telecom company and anything goes wrong, you're on the hook for that. So the telecom companies are like, okay, well, we're not going to let China compromise our
Right.
infrastructure. So we're bringing on yet another ally who's tougher on China. So yeah, the only bad news, unless you're Putin or Xi, there's no bad news here.
That brings us to this very interesting defection of a rather high ranking security official from Moscow who has quite a story to tell about what life is like there right now and what Putin is like on a daily basis. First of all, is this guy legit, this defector?
Yeah, I never, in Georgetown, there's an Ann Pizza. It used to be a very nice little French restaurant. One of the most famous things that ever happened in espionage happened there. There was a Russian defector that went there for lunch with a CIA minder, and then he excused himself and walked up to the Russian embassy and went back to Russia.
Hmm.
And we were never sure if he actually defected and was just mad and went back, or if he defected and fed us a bunch of false information and then went back. So anytime there's defectors or whatever stuff, I mean, the Russians are so steeped in this disinformation and diversion statecraft. I never take any of the first reports at face
Okay.
value.
Okay. So we'll have you back. How long do you want to take to vet it? Yeah. 6 months? I want to talk to
Uh, yeah, year, 2 years.
So all right, well let's stay up in Northern Europe then, and let's turn to the Netherlands now. They've got some electoral turmoil right now. We saw a couple of elections swing over to this new movement that are aligned with the farmers who have been burdened by all of these radical left-wing EU environmental restrictions, and that tipped the scale in some very critical parliamentarian elections. And now it looks like the whole government is up for a referendum vote. That's quite a shame because the Netherlands is a pretty left-leaning country.
Well, this is a European-wide thing, and to go back to Finland for a second, the Finns just had elections on Sunday, and it's funny because we met a Finnish delegation. I said, "Hey, I congratulate you," and they said, "For our ascension in NATO." I said, "No, you had an election and had the results the same day. That's very cool." Uh,
What's
but
that like?
what happened in Finland was the government moved solidly to the center right, and we're seeing this in Northern Europe, Central Europe, Southern Europe, Italy, famously, where we're seeing these center right governments voted back in, and despite the turmoil in Europe, inflation, energy prices, the uncertainty of the war of Ukraine, these center right governments are getting elected, they're getting reelected, and they're proving very resilient. Where we're seeing all the real deep political turmoil in Europe is in La La Land, in the places that are super uber woke, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France. That's where we're seeing very unstable governments. And it's for the very basic bread and butter issue of you have governments who are driving very leftist political agendas and not really responding to the bread and butter issues of concern to the people. And they are really paying a political price for that.
Well, and I hazard to say that that could very well be like Brexit was in 2016, sort of a harbinger for America to follow that path.
I think this is something I think American conservatives need to pay attention to, is rather than saying the Europeans are a bunch of freeloaders and we should turn our back on them and pivot to Asia, we should recognize that there actually is a whole bunch of Europeans who actually understand what's really at stake here better than we do, and who
Mm,
are our partners, and they're not only good on issues like parental rights for education, anti-woke, let's have oil and gas,
yeah.
but they're pro-American, they're anti-Russian, they're anti-Chinese, and they're pro-Ukrainian. and some of our best friends in the world today are in Europe.
Some of them are still freeloaders, though. I mean, they come over to the house, they stay for the weekend. I can't get rid of them, but I'll complain about it later. Thanks, Jim. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.